For 26 days, Donald Trump demanded one thing from Iran: unconditional surrender. No negotiations, no conditions. Surrender. This week, America sent Iran a 15-point list of conditions to end the war. Iran sent back 5 of its own. The country that demanded unconditional surrender is now exchanging condition lists with the country it is bombing. And Iran's military responded to the entire process with 4 words: "You are negotiating with yourselves." If you watch this video to the end, you will understand exactly what is in those 2 lists, why they have essentially zero chance of producing an agreement, and what it tells us about where this war is actually going after 26 days of the most intense bombing campaign in modern history. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you need to understand what Trump was saying just days ago. At a Republican fundraising dinner on Wednesday night, Trump told the room that Iran so badly wants to make a deal but is afraid to say it because their own citizens would turn on them. They're also afraid they'll be killed by us, Trump added. He then described Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, as someone who wanted that job less than any head of a country in history. This is the public posture of a president who believes he is winning so decisively that the other side is desperate for an exit. From that position, you do not send 15-point condition lists. You accept surrender terms. You dictate. You do not negotiate. And yet, the 15-point plan exists. It was delivered to Iran via Pakistan, which has been facilitating indirect contact between Washington and Tehran, and its contents reveal everything about the gap between Trump's public confidence and the actual state of this war. So what does America's 15-point plan actually demand? The full list has not been officially published, but multiple sources with knowledge of its contents have described its core elements to CNN, the New York Times, and other outlets. The conditions include a permanent end to Iran's uranium enrichment program with full IAEA verification, the complete dismantling of Iran's ballistic missile development capability, an end to all Iranian support for proxy forces across the region, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and militias in Iraq and Syria, a formal acknowledgement of Israel's right to exist, a commitment to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and renounce any future use of the waterway as an economic weapon, restrictions on Iran's conventional military capabilities, including its Navy and Air Force, and a series of economic and governance conditions related to how Iran manages its oil revenues and its internal security apparatus. Read that list carefully. These are not the conditions of a ceasefire. These are the conditions of a defeated country's post-war reconstruction, imposed by the victorious power. Every single one of these demands, taken individually, would represent a profound restructuring of Iran's entire national identity, its security posture, and its regional role. Together, they amount to asking Iran to become a fundamentally different kind of state. Iran's response was delivered through its own channels within days. The 5 counter-conditions, as reported by Press TV and confirmed by regional sources, include an immediate and permanent halt to all U.S. and Israeli military strikes on Iranian territory, formal compensation for war damages, which Iran's government has estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars, a binding guarantee that the war will not resume under any circumstances, recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, explicitly legitimizing Tehran's ability to control passage through the waterway, and the removal of all economic sanctions that predate the current conflict, including those imposed under Trump's first-term maximum pressure campaign. Now let's put those 2 lists side by side and look at them honestly. America is demanding that Iran eliminate its nuclear program, dismantle its missile capability, abandon its proxies, and recognize Israel. Iran is demanding that America pay war reparations, guarantee never to attack again, and formally recognize Iranian control of one of the world's most critical international waterways. The gap between these positions is not a negotiating gap. A negotiating gap exists when both sides want roughly the same thing, but disagree on price. This is not a price disagreement. These are 2 countries describing 2 completely different outcomes to the same war. America is describing an outcome in which Iran is permanently diminished as a regional power. Iran is describing an outcome in which Iran emerges from this war with its sovereignty legally reinforced and its enemies financially penalized for attacking it. Iran's military spokesman Ebrahim Zolfaghari captured this reality with the most precise four-word summary anyone has offered. You are negotiating with yourselves. If you are finding this analysis useful, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This is the kind of breakdown that puts the numbers and the statements into context the news rarely provides. Let's keep going. Now, here is what makes this diplomatic exchange more significant than it might appear on the surface. The fact that America sent a 15-point list at all is a strategic concession that Trump has not publicly acknowledged. For 26 days, the stated American position was that there would be no negotiation, unconditional surrender, or continued bombing. Those were the options. By sending a list of conditions, even conditions that Iran cannot accept, the United States has implicitly acknowledged that the war cannot be resolved through military force alone, that some form of diplomatic process is necessary. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said this directly and deliberately. Washington's shift in tone toward negotiations, he said, amounts to an acknowledgement of failure after previously demanding unconditional surrender. Iran is framing the 15-point plan not as American strength, but as American weakness. And from the perspective of the strategic logic Iran has been following since February 28th, that framing has some basis in fact. The war has not produced Iranian surrender. It has not produced regime collapse. It has not produced a popular uprising that overthrows the Islamic Republic. It has produced the worst global energy crisis since 1973, gas prices in America at their highest since 2022, an internationally isolated American diplomatic position, with its allies refusing to help, and a new Iranian supreme leader who has not been seen publicly, but whose written statements continue to reject all paths to peace that do not involve American humiliation first. The 15-point plan is what you send when military pressure alone is not achieving the political outcome you need. Meanwhile, something else is happening simultaneously that directly contradicts the diplomatic signaling. While the 15-point plan was being delivered to Tehran via Islamabad, the United States quietly ordered approximately 1,000 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division to deploy to the Middle East in the coming days. This is in addition to the 2,500 Marines already en route aboard the USS Tripoli and the additional Marine forces aboard the USS Boxer that left California 2 weeks ago. Let's be clear about what the 82nd Airborne is. This is not a peacekeeping force. This is not a logistical unit. The 82nd Airborne Division is the United States Army's primary rapid deployment combat force. It is designed to be operational within 18 hours of receiving an order. It is the force you send when you need thousands of heavily armed combat soldiers somewhere, fast. Its deployment to the Middle East is not compatible with the narrative of a war that is winding down through productive conversations. The Trump administration's explanation for this apparent contradiction is what analysts are calling coercive diplomacy. Send the peace plan to show you are open to a deal. Send the 82nd Airborne to show what happens if Iran refuses the deal. Raphael Cohen, a senior political scientist at RAND, described it this way. President Trump is essentially saying either you can cut a deal now, or face potentially more intense consequences down the road. The theory of coercive diplomacy is sound in principle. The problem is that it requires the other side to believe the threat is credible and to value what it would lose more than it values holding out. Iran has spent 4 weeks demonstrating that it values holding out more than it fears additional military pressure. An additional 1,000 soldiers is unlikely to change that calculation. The German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, visiting Australia this week, offered an assessment that was more honest than anything that has come from Washington or Tel Aviv. There was no consultation, he said. There is no strategy. There is no clear objective. And the worst thing from my perspective is that there is no exit strategy. He called the war a catastrophe for the world's economies. These are the words of a senior minister from one of America's closest NATO allies. Not a hostile critic, an ally. And his assessment matches what every piece of observable evidence about this war's trajectory suggests. Let's talk about the Pakistan channel specifically, because it reveals something important about who actually has leverage in this moment. Pakistan agreed to facilitate indirect talks between the United States and Iran, with a potential meeting in Islamabad being discussed. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed Muslim-majority state with deep historical ties to both Washington and Tehran. Its army chief and prime minister have been personally involved in the facilitation effort. Pakistani analysts familiar with the discussions have told the Associated Press that there has been significant and rapid progress in indirect talks. But here's the crucial detail. Iranian leaders have said they will only agree to talks in Pakistan if there are guarantees that attacks will halt during the negotiation period. America has not offered those guarantees. America is asking Iran to negotiate while continuing to bomb it. Iran is refusing to negotiate while being bombed. And this impasse has been the central diplomatic problem of this war since day one. The 15-point plan does not resolve this impasse. It formalized it on paper. There is one more element of this story that deserves attention. What China is doing. China has publicly supported Pakistan's proposal to host negotiations and has called for a ceasefire and peace talks as the only viable path. China's foreign ministry spokesperson said Beijing supports all efforts conducive to easing tensions, de-escalating the situation, and restoring dialogue. This is significant for several reasons. China is Iran's largest trading partner and the primary buyer of Iranian oil, including the sanctioned barrels that have been flowing through shadow networks for years. China has enormous leverage over Iran's economic survival. If China genuinely wanted to help end this war, it has tools available to it that no other country possesses. But China's support for negotiations is also serving a very specific Chinese strategic interest that has nothing to do with concern for Iranian civilians or global energy markets. China needs the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. China needs oil prices to come down. China needs the global economic disruption caused by this war to end, and China needs to demonstrate to the developing world that it, not America, is the responsible global power advocating for diplomacy over destruction. Every day that this war continues with China calling for peace and America bombing, China's soft power in the global south grows, and America's shrinks. China is not trying to end this war quickly. China is benefiting from the diplomatic positioning that comes from not being the country doing the bombing. Now let's be honest about what the next 5 days actually look like. The second deadline Trump imposed after backing down from the first 48-hour ultimatum expires soon. Iran has made no visible concession on the Strait of Hormuz. The 5 counter-conditions Iran sent are impossible for America to accept without abandoning its stated war aims entirely. The 82nd Airborne is deploying while diplomats exchange papers. Israel's military has told CNN it hopes the war continues for weeks more. And 59% of Americans now oppose the war in polling, the highest opposition since it began. This is not the shape of a war that is approaching resolution. It is the shape of a war that is entering a new phase of complexity, where military escalation and diplomatic signaling are happening simultaneously without a coherent strategy connecting them. And the cost of that complexity is being measured every day in the price of oil, in the electricity bills arriving in European and Japanese homes, in the gas prices at American pumps, and in the 20,000 seafarers stranded in the region, caught between two countries bombing each other and a closed strait that was once the world's most important oil highway. Now let's talk about what this means for you directly. The 15-point plan and Iran's 5 counter-conditions are not abstract diplomatic documents. Their failure or success will determine how long this energy crisis continues. Goldman Sachs maintained its forecast this week that oil will stay above $100 a barrel through 2027. The International Energy Agency has said this crisis is already worse than 1973 and 1979 combined. EasyJet warned its passengers this week that if the war persists, ticket prices will begin feeding through to the consumer towards the back end of the summer. Every week that the gap between these two condition lists remains unbridged is a week that the global energy system stays in crisis, a week that gas prices stay elevated, a week that the economic pressure on every family in every energy importing country continues. The 15 conditions and the 5 counter-conditions are not just a diplomatic story. They are a direct economic story about the cost of a war that has no clear path to the exit that was supposed to be obvious from the beginning. There is one more development this week that captures the full absurdity of where this war has arrived. Iran's parliament is reportedly moving forward with legislation to formally codify Iranian sovereignty and control over the Strait of Hormuz, turning the de facto blockade into a permanent legal framework. If passed, this law would mean that Iran is not simply closing the strait temporarily as a war measure, it would be establishing in statute that it has the legal right to charge passage fees, restrict transit, and control the waterway indefinitely. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed this week that vessels wishing to pass through the strait may do so after coordination with Iranian authorities. The Strait of Hormuz, which international maritime law designates as a waterway open to free passage by all nations, would become, under Iranian law, a toll booth that every energy-importing nation in the world must negotiate with Tehran to access. Think about what that means in practice. Japan, which imports 70% of its oil through the strait, would need Iranian permission to receive its own energy supply. South Korea, Germany, India, China, every major industrial economy that depends on Gulf energy would need to maintain a relationship with Tehran that satisfies whatever conditions Iran sets for passage. The leverage this creates for Iran is permanent and structural, not temporary and military. And the United States, by going to war without a clear plan for how to resolve the strait question, has potentially accelerated the legal and political framework that makes Iranian control of the strait a permanent feature of the global energy system, rather than a temporary wartime disruption. America's 15-point plan demands that Iran renounce this leverage. Iran's 5 counter-conditions demand that America formally recognize it. And somewhere in the space between those two demands, the world's energy supply is stuck waiting for an answer that neither side is currently capable of providing. So let's bring this together. For 26 days, Trump demanded unconditional surrender. This week, America sent Iran 15 conditions. Iran sent back 5. The two lists have zero meaningful overlap. Iran's military called it self-negotiation. The 82nd Airborne is deploying to the Middle East while diplomats exchange papers. China is calling for peace while benefiting from the positioning. Pakistan is trying to host talks that Iran will only attend if bombing stops, which America refuses to do. And 59% of Americans oppose a war that is now entering its 5th week with no ceasefire, no surrender, no exit strategy, and no end in sight. Germany's defense minister said there is no strategy and no exit plan. Iran's military said America is negotiating with itself, and the global energy crisis that this war created is on track to outlast every diplomatic deadline that has been set and missed so far. The gap between 15 and 5 is not just a number. It is the width of a war that nobody knows how to end. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Do you think these 2 condition lists will ever find common ground? Or is this war going to continue until one side simply runs out of the ability to keep fighting? I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next video.